On this episode of Newt's World, President Trump welcomed Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to the White House on Tuesday. It was the first visit by a foreign leader in Trump's second term. Ostensibly, the meeting was for the leaders to discuss the negotiations for a second phase of a ceasefire deal that would end the war with Hamas and return all Israeli hostages from captivity in Gaza. However, the headlines coming from their meeting were about President Trump's proposal for the United States, quote, to take over the Gaza Strip and, quote, own it. Here to discuss the meeting and the future of Israel, I'm really pleased to welcome my guest, Israel Ellis. His new book is The Wake-Up Call, Global Jihad and the Rise of Antisemitism in a World Gone Mad. And mad, by the way, in his book is all caps. Israel, welcome, and thank you for joining me on Newt's World.
Thank you very much, Newt. I really very much appreciate you having me on today.
Well, this is a remarkable time since I was just at the press conference. I've known Bibi since 1984, and watching the two of them interact was fascinating. Can you walk us through what you think made Netanyahu's visit to Washington so significant in terms of diplomatic relations?
I think that President Trump is putting his stake in the ground, and he is declaring his incredible support for the state of Israel, which in his first term he declared, and he is now picking that up, and he is making this a cornerstone of his next administration, of this current administration that he's now come into. And he's making good on his campaign promises. He's walking the talk. I don't think Trump needs to pander necessarily to specifically the Jewish people. I believe this is a moral call of what's right is right, and he recognizes the severity of the disillusionment of what's happened in the past and the fact that we've been negotiating with terrorists and setting up sort of Iran by itself, the proxies, to go ahead and culminate into what happened on October 7th. So I'm really encouraged in all of this sort of wokeness and of the world that we've been living in, of this crazy dissonance and the unreasonableness of what has been labeled the useful idiots. It is refreshing. It is a splash of water to finally see someone stand up and talk common sense and say, we've got to end this. And we got to move forward, and this is how we're going to do it.
I was very struck with the boldness of what Trump was proposing, but also with the balance. He spoke in a way more favorably about Palestinians as people and about Iranians as people, putting in context that doesn't have to be hostility, that in fact there ought to be a way we could move forward by eliminating the terrorism and by eliminating the nuclear weapons, and move towards a world where everybody could be dramatically safer and dramatically more prosperous. And I thought that was a maturity that I suspect Trump has acquired over the last 8 years that makes him very different in that he's tougher than our most accommodationist presidents, but at the same time, he's actually trying to find a way to relate to the very people he's being tough with. I thought that was a very interesting balancing act.
I agree. And it is often the leaders of these countries that are corrupt and use their citizens as human shields and victimize them. And they live in squalor, these people. And to distract the world from their corruption, they use this sort of narrative of what they're going to do. But Trump, I agree with you 100%. What he has done is he's humanized the situation. And I recall where he specifically answered a reporter who was antagonizing him and said, of course, Palestinian people, all people will be welcome here. That's the whole point of this. And that was the whole point in 2005 when Israel handed off the Gaza Strip to Fatah at the time, and we all know what happened, and Hamas took over. But the whole point was to give the Palestinian people an opportunity at what they've been asking for at the statehood. And of course, we know what happened, what they've turned Gaza into, what they could have turned it into is a different story. And that's what President Trump, he's classic real estate tycoon and sort of sees the vision. I got to love it. I got to love what he says. But he's absolutely right. I've been there. I've been to Gaza. I've been along the Mediterranean coast. Tel Aviv is unbelievable what they've done with Tel Aviv and the boardwalk and the hotels. And it's just beautiful. The beaches. There's no reason why you can't have that in Gaza. Gaza could be the Riviera of the Middle East and cater to all these people. It could facilitate thousands of jobs and coexistence and peace. But, Newt, without respect and without the education and removing the syllabus of hate, it's going to be a difficult challenge to achieve that. I like what you're saying, and I like Trump's attitude of the Iranians are people. I know many Persians. They're wonderful people, very intelligent, but the Iranian regime is evil. And I'm sure that there are Gazans, there are Palestinians that just want to live their lives, to have good lives, just like anybody else out there. But there are the corrupt leadership that uses these people as human shields, and that's the most terrible result and tragic result of much of this that's happened.
You raise, I think, two very different points. If we can just stick with Gaza for a minute. One is, how do we go in a very tough-minded way, for example, and eliminate all of the hatred from the school system? We denazify Germany in a very aggressive way. And we almost need to recognize that it's not just Hamas as a military force, but it's the psychology of Hamas and the psychology of hatred that has to be driven out. At the same time, if we can find a way to do that, and that's one project, if we think about the point you made about Gaza, the same point that Trump made, which is if you take the natural gas offshore, which probably is valuable enough that by itself could pay for a great deal of the reconstruction. If you actually had safety, so you would have a Riviera. I'm certain that as a real estate guy, Trump looked at the current disaster in Gaza. In the back of his head, he's thinking, okay, the Trump golf courses will go over here. The Trump beachfront hotel will be over here. I felt like I was listening to a guy who's right at the edge of a real estate deal rather than dealing with a guy who's just thinking politically. But that's part of his genius.
Probably a great investment.
I've talked to him about it. He's absolutely convinced that properly developed, Gaza will be one of the highest points of return. Israelis have a $44,000 a year per capita income. Before the war, Gaza was a little above 1,000.
Well, 1,000 for people who didn't work for UNRWA. UNRWA pays its employees, many of them Hamas operatives, about $235,000 US a year. My son is an IDF, was in the IDF, an active service in Gaza, and he would call me from the mansions that belonged to the Hamas operatives where they were stationed, and he'd say, Dad, don't think for a second this is just such third world. I got to tell you what we found here. And he went through, he showed me a lot of the stuff, state-of-the-art audio systems, flat-screen TVs, gorgeous Mediterranean side mansions. Weren't looking so good when he was there, but would have looked really good at some point. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of corruption there. I want to address what you just said, though, about what do we need to move forward and sort of the education. If I can just touch on that for a minute. First of all, there can be, in the short term, absolutely no compromise when it comes to demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, and Hamas must go. They must be outlawed. They are a terrorist organization. They're a bad faith actor. You cannot believe anything they say. They are terrorists, and they have to go. They cannot remain in control. I do agree in an international or in some kind of effort to bring in a government, a local government of some kind. And I think that we have to be draconian about our efforts over there. There can be no compromise. There is no negotiation. This current hostage deal that's being done is being done because it has to be done. But, you're dealing with the lovers of death. And I talk about that in the wake-up call, the lovers of life versus the lovers of death. And yes, here we are in Western civilization, and that is actually why the MAD is capitalized on my book, because we have grown up, as you know, Newt, we've grown up in this theory, this political theory of mutually assured destruction when it came to the East and West hegemonic battle for control over the world. It's always been about, hey, if we build up enough arms to take them up and they build enough arms to take us out, no one's going to push the button. But that thinking, that leverage of human life, the value that we give to human life does not apply to these jihadists. And that is a key point that Western civilization needs to understand. So yes, we have to completely wipe out Hamas, and there can be no terrorism. And you're going to have to deal with Iran because Iran is funding this, and we have to set rules for proxies like countries like Qatar that is pouring billions of dollars into this, that have facilitated it. That's a whole other subject. But we must deal with the head of the snake here, because as long as they're dealt with, they will continue to provide terror proxies to unsettle any plans. And I want to talk about education, because it's not just the education and the syllabus of hate that's happening in Gaza. Of course, that's happening, and kids from a very young age are taught terrible untruths about Israel and are taught about violence and about everything about genocidal intent and sacrificing their lives to this cause. And this is an edict coming from a much higher source. But also in America, also in any free world, we've got it on Australia and Europe and Canada, especially Canada. And in America, we need to legislatively define what hate is. We need to finally put our foot down and say, when you go ahead and have slogans of genocide, slogans that ultimately are a cover-up for genocide, that needs to be outlawed. And I know it's controversial because it's definitely going to conflict with the First Amendment and with the whole thing of freedom of speech. And I get that, but they have used freedom of speech against our moral compass to instigate this syllabus of hate that is used to promote violence against Jewish people. But it's not just violence against Jewish people, because the jihadists there are no rules to who they take out. On January 1st in New Orleans, we saw a truck plow through a lot of people, Christians, Jews, Muslims. It doesn't matter who they are. It's indiscriminate. The collateral damage is of no consequence. What matters is the global message of violence to take over the world. And that's what people need to understand, what's at stake. So yes, we have to go in. We have to define hate. We have to outlaw hate. And we have to encourage or legislate or somehow supervise, I think anyways, the syllabus that we're teaching our children, because it happens with our children. It happens at a very young age where we must, like you said, in Europe, we denazified Germany. That is exactly what needs to happen here, and it has to happen with a heavy hand, and I think President Trump might be the right guy to at least get that started.
Were you surprised by the scale of anti-Semitism on the American campuses?
I was shocked. I was blown away. I was completely betrayed. I cannot believe not only the speed by which it happened. Newt, I left for Europe on October 8th, and I went on a tour for some business to several different cities, and I couldn't believe the speed in which the protests, it was like it was all planned. It was all staged, ready to launch. And many of these people that are on these campuses are not students. They're bussed in, they're paid for by organizations that have for years backed acronyms like BDS, like boycott, divestment, and sanctions. DEI components have come in there. People think that they're joining this as social justice warriors when in fact it's just unbridled hate and anti-Semitism. And when you have three of the presidents of the most prestigious universities in America go before Congress under oath, and when asked if anything that's going on jeopardizes the safety of the Jewish students on campus, and they say undeniably no, and they say that is yet to be determined, it is an embarrassment. It is a shameful thing to America. But not only watching the speed in which these encampments and protests have taken place, that's not the shocking thing. The shocking thing is the betrayal and the inability and the hesitation by the very people who protect our social contract, by the public administration of justice, and by the policing mechanisms that are in place to keep social order, to stand by and to just allow this to happen without our leaders speaking up strongly about it. And in fact, by doing so, the apathy has encouraged, the complacency has endorsed, and the actions have rationalized and justified this continued type of anti-Semitism. This is what happened in the 1930s, and this is what's now shockingly happening in 2024 and 2025. And so you asked me if I was shocked. I have to tell you something, Newt, to be honest with you. I grew up disillusioned. I grew up as a Canadian. I felt safe. I felt privileged. I felt protected. I felt that I was under a social contract that worried about every one of the diversified, multicultural citizens of this country. And I was shocked and betrayed. I felt complete betrayal as a Jewish person. I felt totally betrayed by my own government. I felt unwelcome in my own home. And I suspect that many, many people have felt the same way. And I talk about this in the wake-up call because I just had to get it out and I articulate that for people who feel that type of isolation.
Do you think that it's as bad in Europe?
I think it's worse. At the risk of sounding Islamophobic, because we have to stop that. We have to stop being worried about what we sound like. I've encountered like the Muslim radical ideology and jihadism that has infected Europe has screwed Europe. I mean, demographically, it's well over the percentage. If they don't nip this, I don't know how they're going to save themselves. But I would say that Europe is definitely at much greater risk of radicalization. You've got complete neighborhoods that are under Sharia law that the regular police will not even enter into, where they warn you not to come into. But it's coming to America and it's coming to Canada. I got to tell you that there is an artery here in Toronto that is access to a highway called the 401 that is just on the outskirts of a Jewish area, predominantly Jewish area in North York. And when I approached that on-ramp and there was protesters with flags saying from the river to the sea, which is a genocidal intent for sure, the mantra that has come up amongst many others have come up. And a police officer, and I'm seeing them serve coffee to the protesters, and a police officer comes out to me and says, "Sir, I think you should turn around and I think you should go back to where you came from. This is too unsafe for you." I was like, what are you talking about? I was incredulous. We have a beautiful mall downtown in Toronto called the Eaton Centre, and there's a store that's available in America as well called Zara's. And for some reason, I don't know exactly what the reason was. I think it was some kind of advertising that offended the pro-Palestinian segment. And people were masked, and they're masked when they protest. They've got these keffiyehs, and they hide their faces, and they're intimidating, and they're violent. The guy comes up to the police officer, and right in his face, he says, "I'm going to take you 6 feet under, man," because the officer was trying to keep order and protect the store. And they did nothing. They allowed this guy to just spew out this type of threat against police. I don't know, but in America, you go up to an officer of the law and you threaten to kill them, I think you're going down. I think you're going down.
Well, you should be.
Yeah, it's absolutely unacceptable. So the narrative that's come out of this, what I call the lawlessness and anarchy that has really been birthed by the events of October 7th, the aftermath, but it's the complacency that has given license to the rise in anti-Semitism. That is what scares me more than anything else, Newt. And I'm glad to see the turnaround. I'm glad to see President Trump has called it what it is. He's revamping the education system and he's calling it out. And I really felt like for once in a long time, I felt like, I could breathe. I could breathe. This craziness and this lunacy of what we've experienced in the previous administration and disillusionment of the liberal left wokeism is starting to crumble and fade away, and it's no longer in favor.
Let me switch for a second to the October 7th attack, which has been described as the worst military breakdown in Israel's history and certainly the largest assault on the Jewish community since the Holocaust. How could such an attack have happened?
That very single question is on the tip of everyone's tongue. everywhere where I've been. And it was the impetus for me running this book. Because on January 18th, when I traveled to Israel in 2024, after my son, I was supposed to go before, right after October 7th, I told him I'm coming. He's like, Dad, do not come. I don't need to be worried about you here. I've got a job to do, and you and Mom need to stay where you are. Please do not come here. It was very difficult to hear that and very scary at the same time, but I understood it and I respected it. I didn't want to distract him. And when we came in January, one of the first things I did is, because I just couldn't understand, like you, I asked the same question. Everyone asks the same questions. How did this happen? I phoned up a military contact of mine. I've got several contacts in the IDF, and I've got permission to go into the border of Gaza. And I said to them, I want to walk from the border that was breached in Gaza by Nahal Oz, which is where the greatest amount of damage was done to that base, and that was my son's base at one time. And I wanted to walk from there to Be'eri. And I walked it, and it took me under 40 minutes to walk it. And you can imagine these terrorists, 5,000 terrorists that took 2 years to develop this plan, were on bikes, motorbikes, and hand gliders and pickup trucks. So it only took them about 15 minutes to travel that 2 kilometers. And I wanted to travel this. And let me tell you something. The land between Gaza, between the border and between Be'eri, is beautiful, idyllic land. It's rolling hills. It's wonderful. People have picnics. It's park area. It's conservation area. You're not talking about desert here. It's beautifully maintained land. And they made their way there. When I went to Be'eri, I walked inside Be'eri, which is the kibbutz, where many people were brutally murdered on that day, where people were kidnapped. And I saw the bullet holes. In fact, I walked in there and I saw stains on the streets. But the worst thing was, Newt, was that there was a green tent set up on a playground, on a children's playground, where you had a rabbi, where you had archaeologists, and where you had doctors. And you know what they were doing? They were sifting through the ashes and running them through DNA so that Jewish people wouldn't be buried alongside those that murdered them. And I lost it. And that night, I went back to my Tel Aviv apartment. My wife and I had gone to the hospital at Toshamer to talk with many of the survivors of the Nova Festival who are now amputees and terribly disfigured. And we went to try to just speak to them and let them know that we're here. We do that regularly. And I went back and I went to sleep that night. I was exhausted. I got up at 4 a.m. and I was in a cold sweat. And I sat at my computer as I overlooked the Tel Aviv skyline that was just starting to wake up. And I started to cry. I cried for humanity. I cried for the devastation and the brutality that can come to this. I don't care about the politics. I don't care about what is the background for this. But the fact is that that type of brutalization, not only does it happen, but that people are out in the streets rationalizing it. Women were raped. Children were beheaded. People were kidnapped. They are being used as human shields. Human life being commoditized for terrorist purposes. And we are forced to negotiate with those terrorists. And I cried. And on my computer screen, I wrote HOW, the same question you just asked me. And I sat there, and over the course of a night, I felt a calling. And I felt 7 observations that I made. And that is what the book is about. The 7 observations that I made to answer the observations that I posit as to the how of October 7th having happened. And I could tell you those observations, but the entire book is based on it. And so if you ask me, it's not a simple question. You know, in the Old Testament, when someone came to Rabbi Hillel and said, can you please explain to me the entire Testament? He said, I can't do that on one foot, but I'll tell you what, and this has to apply to us today. He says, if you love your fellow man as you would yourself, if you have respect for each other, that will solve all the world problems. One of the 7th reasons that I come up with in the observations I made is disunity in the world. Disunity between people. The fact that we've lost our way and that we allowed something like this to happen because Israel was put into such a situation to be manipulated by the outside interests of other countries, of other leaders, and to have to end up with a negotiating policy, a policy of prosperity for peace, so that they would turn a blind eye to the very people who are terrorists, who have proven themselves as terrorists, as they spent 2 years to plan out this attack. That is the terrible tragedy of this. The fact that we have organizations that claim to be legitimate organizations that to govern the social contract, if you will, of the world, like the United Nations, who have abused and betrayed the very principle by which they are supposed to stand. And we need a reset of all of that. But 7 observations that I made in the wake-up call, which include the East-West battle for dominance. I think this thing goes 75 years back. I think a lot of ideologies were developed that have kind of brought this forward. Non-state terror proxies. I've talked about Iran. Iran is the head of the snake. The Iranian regime has proxies, including Hezbollah, including Hamas, including the Houthi, and including many others lined up to do their bidding with funding from Qatar and from other areas. That's got to stop. The funding of terrorism to the tune of $2 billion that went into the Gaza Strip, including UNRWA, a budget of $1.6 billion. Let me tell you, Newt, terrorism is big business. We know that. There's people at the top of the food chain who are more than happy to let young people die and kill themselves and kill others. But these guys, they got beautiful investments in the West. They've got good wealth managers. Probably it's some Jewish wealth manager is probably managing their cash and stuff, making investments for them. It's terrible. Anyway, funding of terrorism. The Palestinian refugee crisis is a non-crisis, in my opinion. I explain why in the book. It's the biggest gaffe. It's the victimization of the Palestinian people. There is no refugee crisis. And the syllabus of hate, which I've already talked about, Israel's political system does not meet the needs of its masters. Today, Israel's political system does not serve the heterogeneous society that Israel has become. We have to change that. Israel does not have a constitution. It does not have 2 houses. It does not have a proper electoral system. That must be changed because the people are not being properly represented. And minority interests tend to be driving the policies of the country. And finally, Jewish disunity. We've gone through, our enemies were watching. And it says something about Israel, and it says something about the democracy of Israel, and the fact that Israel is the only place in the Middle East where people can rally and can demonstrate against the government without fear of reprisal, without fear of imprisonment, without fear of violence. But yet, the world watched as the Jews were divided, because the world holds the Jewish people at a higher standard perhaps. But our enemies were also watching. And as the good book will tell you, as the Old Testament will tell you, when Moses brought the people into Israel, he made a declaration, very, very simple. If you observe the way of the land, then you will be safe from your enemies. But as soon as you don't observe the way of the land, which we call in Hebrew derech eretz, as soon as you do not observe the way of the land, your enemies will notice. They will come and they will destroy you. And what is the way of the land? I said it before. It's respect for each other. The root of the way of land is respect. Those are the 7 observations I made, Newt.
Why does Qatar get away with being such a center of supporting terrorism?
My son says something that made me fall off the chair. He said, "Dad, there is no Allah when you own a Bugatti." And I think that these guys, they're in business. It's big business terrorism. And they've got interests that are going to benefit from an unstable Middle East, where they're sort of seen as the negotiator, as the gatekeeper. I really don't know enough. I've been to Bahrain, I've been to Dubai, I've been to the area over there. I have not been to Qatar. But they have become a safe haven to situation themselves as a broker between the terrorists. And it's really doing the deal with the devil. But how they get away with it, that's not a question for me to answer.
But it seems to me that's a place where the Trump approach could change them overnight.
And I think that they're probably worried about that too. And they're pivoting. They're pivoting because they're not stupid people. And they realize, just like all these corporations that came to sit by the king at the inauguration, They realize where their bread is buttered. Trump started in his first administration, courageously enough. I think the Abraham Accords were heroic, and they continue to be the guiding light for peace in the Middle East. I've been in business many years. I've been a writer. I've been involved in many things. And there's one thing I've learned. You got to move forward. You got to move forward. And you've got a few years on me, a little bit more experience, and I don't know if you'd agree with me.
Absolutely. And if you watch Trump, that's his entire style.
And I agree. We need to move forward. Okay, I'm not suggesting or minimizing at all, but, I wrote another book before this book called Moving Through Walls, where I talked about grief and I talked about injustice. And I say to people that you have 3 times that you can talk about the injustice. At the 4th time, you become a victim. And you need to move forward, and you need to change the narrative, and you need to become a hero of your own story. I cannot even imagine the pain and suffering of people who are affected by war, affected by terrorism, affected by everything. And I'm talking about the people within Gaza just as much as I'm talking about the people within Israel. And I'm not talking about sides here. I'm talking about human suffering that happens at the hands of powerful people. And I can imagine that, but we can't perpetuate the violence. Violence long-term will not work. We need to find a place, a middle ground. We need to find love, and we need to find peace, and we do that through prosperity. And Trump knows this. Feed people. Give them a future. Give their children a future. Give them an opportunity to be educated. We need to remove the terror, the jihadists, the violence. We need to cut the head of the snake right off. And we need to move forward. And that is what President Trump is doing. I've got to provide him the accolades he deserves, the credit he deserves, despite the man himself. Okay? And we all know the Trumpism, but he's doing what needs to be done, the hard work, and he's playing it straight and candid and to the point. And we need that now in the world. We need saving.
I would offer a slight modification of what you just said. You need understanding and love and support immediately after victory. We had to beat Nazi Germany and then denazify. We have to destroy Hamas and then treat the Palestinian people much better than they've been treated. We have to break the theocratic dictatorship and then deal with the Iranian people as they should be. But there is a component of first making sure that the people who want to kill you can't. Otherwise, nothing works.
I completely agree with you, Newt, and I appreciate your wisdom, and you're absolutely right. It is a hard reality that we have to face, but like I said before, we have to be draconian in the short term, and that's correct. There can be no compromise. There can be no compromise.
Well, it's really a variation of something Churchill had said, that you have to have victory, but then you have to have generosity.
And compassion and empathy and understanding, and we have to implement that right away. We learned about that when we're in sports. In my coach, we'd win a game, and the first thing you got to do is shake the hands of the people you won against. I think that is a hard thing to do. That is a very hard thing to do, and we're going to need some very mature discipline.
One of the greatest weaknesses of Israel, which I've talked about a lot for 20 years, is you have to have a vision of a future in which peace and prosperity and safety are possible for everybody in the region. And so you have to have a larger vision than just stopping Hamas. You have to have a vision of a Palestinian future that somehow offers them a sense of hope and something better than killing.
This is where I come to with respect to Israel's political system, is that the voice of reason is lost in the radicalization of people on the right. And what you're saying is something that many people within the center of the political spectrum agree with. And I would say the majority of the people agree with. We want to live peacefully, and we want to live beside our neighbors peacefully. The idea of this constant stress of violence needs to be removed from our future. And you're absolutely correct. It is a weakness, and it's a weakness of Israel that is designed by the very fact that we have a political system where we must negotiate and form governments through negotiations with those who represents the smallest of minority in the country. And I'm going to say this, and maybe it's unpopular, and it's not that I'm a peacenik, and I'm not a political person, but I'm just a theorist. I'm a political theorist, and I see it, and you're absolutely right. You've got the wisdom, and definitely from the experience of many years of having seen this repeat itself over and over again. The only long-term solution is going to be education, is going to be peace, is going to be respect, is going to be understanding. And it's the art of the deal. And Trump will say this, and I've heard it, and it's what I bring into my business as well. When you negotiate a deal, you got to negotiate a deal and propose the deal that you would accept if you were on the other side, because that's a true partnership. So once the violence is gone, once we're able to eliminate the threat, we can't take our foot and put it on the chest of those and subjugate them. Otherwise, we do continue this cycle of violence. We need to step back and we need to offer them a deal of life. The problem, though, Newt, and this is the problem, the impossible situation that we're in, is that these are the lovers of death. They believe in this martyrdom. They believe in the idea that there are 72 versions awaiting them. They believe that martyrdom is their raison d'etre to life. And we have to remove that from the education of the young people from kindergarten. And we need these children to understand. We need them to become lovers of life. So the real challenge here is being able to change the attitude of the lovers from death to the lovers of life. Because as long as you have the lovers of death, and as long as you have unreasonable people out there who, in the name of social justice and whatever other disillusionment that they're marching for, as long as the unreasonableness continues, as long as we support the lovers of death and rationalize these idiots, these terrible people as resistance fighters, okay? As long as we do that and not call it what it is, then it's going to be very difficult to get to a deal where we give our partners what they want, because you need a partner in good faith. You need to have that reasonableness there. So once that's there, for sure, that is what we need to do. But how do we get there is the question.
Well, that's one of the great challenges of our time. Israel, I want to thank you for joining me. Your new book, The Wake-Up Call, Global Jihad and the Rise of Antisemitism in a World Gone Mad, is available now on Amazon and in bookstores everywhere. And we're going to feature a link to buy it on our show page. And I really appreciate you sharing with us your vision, your concerns, and we certainly hope that your son remains safe in his mission in the Israeli Defense Force.
Thank you very much, Newt. God bless you. And I really appreciate the opportunity to come here and to spread some of my wisdom and what I've learned. And I really, truly hope that people will purchase the book, and please review the book. We need your reviews. The book is designed to provide information, well-researched, well-cited information. It's written in my voice. It's a story that weaves through the reality of the situation in the region, and it provides an answers. The last chapter of the book, Newt, is on healing. It's a chapter of healing, and I talk about how do we heal? How do we move forward into the future so that we can live in a world of peace? And I hope people take it to heart. I hope they take the message to heart, and I hope they live the message. Because if we all live the message, then we'll have a different world that we can leave to our children.
Well, I hope your prayers are answered.
Thank you, Newt.
Thank you to my guest, Israel Ellis. You can get a link to buy his new book, The Wake-Up Call, on our show page at newtsworld.com. Newt's World is produced by Gingrich 360 and iHeartMedia. Our executive producer is Garnsey Sloan, and our researcher is Rachel Peterson. The artwork for the show was created by Steve Penley. Special thanks to the team at Gingrich 360. If you've been enjoying Newt's World, I hope you'll go to Apple Podcasts and both rate us with 5 stars and give us a review so others can learn what it's all about. Right now, listeners of Newt's World can sign up for my 3 free weekly columns at gingrich360.com/newsletter. I'm Newt Gingrich. This is Newt's World.